The metal cup burns her fingers, but she refuses to let go. For 3 years, her sensory world has been reduced to the smell of wet wool, unwashed bodies, and the acrid, metallic tang of burning rubble. Now, suddenly, the air in this damp processing center is violently hijacked by a forgotten scent: roasted coffee beans. Real beans, not the chicory root ersatz water that has stained her teeth since 1943, but the thick, oily aroma of American abundance. Her hands, gray with grime and mapped with the red lesions of chilblains, tremble as she stares at the slice of bread. It sits on the edge of the crate, shocking in its brightness. It looks like cake, soft, crustless, and impossibly sponge-like compared to the sawdust-filled Kommissbrot she survived on during the retreat. She hesitates. Her stomach, shrunken and tight against her spine, sends a spasm of warning. To eat this is to admit defeat, not militarily, but biologically. The American GI standing above her isn't holding a rifle, he is holding a ladle, and the steam rising from it is terrifying. She takes the bite. The sweetness of the processed flour coats her tongue, and for the first time since the surrender, the adrenaline fades, replaced by a sharp, agonizing hunger. The mud hell, disarmed enemy forces, and the cage without walls. To understand the shock of that white bread, we must first understand the texture of the mud that preceded it. By April 1945, the Third Reich hadn't just surrendered, it had liquefied. The logistical spine of Central Europe was shattered, leaving millions of soldiers, civilians, and auxiliaries drifting in a void of authority. For the Allied forces, this wasn't just a victory, it was a management crisis of biblical proportions. The result was the Rheinwiesenlager, the Rhine meadow camps, a string of open-air enclosures stretching along the riverbanks, designed not to house human beings, but to contain a flood. There were no barracks here, there were no tents, there were no latrines. There was only the wet, alluvial soil of the Rhine floodplains and rolls of American barbed wire. For the women caught in this net, the Wehrmacht-Helferinnen, female army auxiliaries, nurses, and signals personnel, the camp was a lesson in total exposure. The golden cage of American captivity, rumors of which had circulated among the starving German troops as a promise of warmth and chocolate, revealed itself to be a muddy abyss. The ground, churned by hundreds of thousands of boots, turned into a viscous slurry that reached the ankles, then the knees. It was a cold, clinging substance that sucked the heat from the body faster than the damp air. The legal designation was the first weapon used against them. They were not designated as prisoners of war, POWs, a status that would have guaranteed them the protections of the Geneva Convention, specifically the same rations as the capturing army's rear echelon troops. Instead, General Dwight Eisenhower classified them as Disarmed Enemy Forces, DEF. It was a bureaucratic sleight of hand with lethal somatic consequences. A POW was entitled to 2,000 calories a day. A DEF was entitled to whatever was available. In the chaos of 1945, whatever was available often meant less than 700 calories, a slow-motion death sentence carried out by metabolism. For a woman in the Rheinwiesenlager, survival required an immediate shedding of civilization. Privacy was the first casualty. With no sanitary facilities, the biological imperative of digestion became a public spectacle of shame. The latrines were often just open logs thrown across ditches that overflowed when the rains came. The smell was a physical weight, a mixture of dysentery, unwashed skin, and the sweet, rotting scent of gangrene. Women, raised in strict, modest social codes of the 1930s, found themselves squatting in the open, shielding their bodies with tattered Wehrmacht greatcoats, trying to maintain a shred of dignity while the body failed them. The nights were the most dangerous. Without shelter, prisoners were forced to dig into the earth with their hands, tin cans or spoons, creating erdholen, earth holes. These shallow graves offered the only protection against the wind, but they were treacherous. When the heavy spring rains hit, the holes would collapse or fill with water, burying sleepers alive or waking them in a pool of freezing mud. The women huddled together in these pits, a tangle of limbs seeking friction heat. This was the somatic reality of the defeat. It wasn't a signed document in a schoolhouse in Rheims. It was the bone-deep ache of sleeping in wet clothes that never dried, the skin turning gray and translucent, and the terrifying realization that the victors, overwhelmed by numbers, might just let them fade away into the mud. The American GIs guarding the perimeter were often just as stunned. Many were fresh replacements who had never seen combat, expecting to guard fierce SS troopers, only to find themselves staring at a sea of shivering humanity that included thousands of women in gray skirts, their hair matted, their lips cracked from dehydration. The psychological distance between the guard in his warm poncho and the woman in the mud hole was measured in calories. One had the energy to stand, the other barely had the energy to shiver. This power dynamic, absolute biological dominance, set the stage for every interaction that followed. The hunger wasn't just a sensation, it was the primary governing law of the camp. The hunger winter, when the body cannibalizes itself. If the summer of 1945 was defined by mud, the winter of 1946-47 was defined by a silence so deep it felt like the earth had stopped spinning. This was the hunger winter, the coldest winter of the 20th century, arriving precisely when the German infrastructure had ceased to exist. For the women released from the open-air camps and returning to the civilian sectors, or those still held in unheated barracks, the war had mutated into a simpler, deadlier enemy: the cold. The somatic experience of this cold was distinct from the sharp nip of a winter breeze. It was a metabolic cold. Without adequate calories, the body's internal furnace simply went out. Women described a sensation of their bones turning into ice rods, a chill that radiated from the inside out. In the unheated cellars of bombed-out cities like Cologne or Berlin, where window panes were replaced by cardboard and rags, the temperature inside often matched the temperature outside, 20 degrees below zero. Breath didn't just mist, it froze on the blankets. The German supply chain had collapsed into a chaotic barter economy. The Reichsmark was worthless paper. The only currency that mattered was the calorie. The official ration for a normal consumer, which included most releasees and women, dropped between 700 and 1,000 calories per day. To put this in visceral terms, 2 slices of dry bread, a smear of margarine the size of a thumbnail, and a bowl of watery soup made from turnips or stinging nettles. That was fuel for 24 hours. The human body, when starved to this degree, begins a horrific process of autophagus survival. It eats itself. First, the fat reserves vanish, leaving the skin hanging loose like ill-fitting fabric. Then the muscles atrophy. For thousands of women, this manifested as hunger edema, Hungerodem. It was a cruel paradox. As they starved, they appeared to gain weight. Their ankles swelled until they spilled over their shoes, their bellies distended, mimicking pregnancy. But it wasn't flesh, it was water retention caused by extreme protein deficiency. Pressing a thumb into a shin left a dent that wouldn't fade for minutes. Physiology dictated a new reality for womanhood. For nearly an entire generation of German women aged 16 to 40, menstruation simply stopped. Amenorrhea became the norm. The body, sensing the total lack of resources, shut down the reproductive system to keep the heart and lungs functioning. There were no sanitary pads, no tampons, and now no blood. The fear of permanent infertility was a whispered terror in the barracks and queues. They felt desexed, reduced to genderless skeletons shuffling through the snow. This was the landscape of the Golden Cage. While the Americans had logistics, jeeps that ran, heaters that hummed, and mess halls that smelled of frying meat, the women on the other side of the wire or the cellar door were living in a biological twilight. They weren't just hungry, they were hollowed out. The shock of the mundane that would come later, the soap, the nylon, the white bread, would hit these bodies with the force of a drug because they had been stripped of every buffering layer of comfort. They were raw nerves, exposed to the elements, waiting for a signal that life, real life, was still possible. The hygiene crisis, the war on the skin. If hunger was a dull, constant ache, hygiene, or the lack of it, was a sharp, stinging humiliation. In the Rheinwiesenlager and the refugee centers, the enemy was no longer the Red Army or the RAF, it was the Kleiderlaus, the body louse. For the Wehrmacht-Helferinnen, who had been drilled in the obsessive cleanliness of the German military code, the infestation was a psychological shattering. The lice didn't just bite, they swarmed. Survivors described the somatic horror of feeling their clothes ripple on their bodies. The seams of their gray skirts and tunics turned white with eggs. The itch was maddening, a constant fiery pricking that made sleep impossible. Women would sit for hours in the mud, engaging in the ritual of searching, cracking the lice between their thumbnails. The sound, a tiny, wet pop, became the background noise of captivity. Then came the American response, the Entlausung station. To a modern observer, it looks like a public health measure. To the woman standing in line, it felt like an assault. They were herded into tents, often ordered to strip or loosen their clothing in front of gum-chewing GIs. Then came the puffer gun, a metal punk that blasted DDT powder down their backs, into their armpits, and into their pubic hair. The sensation was suffocating. The white cloud choked the lungs and coated the skin in a dry chemical film that tasted of chalk and poison. But the shame ran deeper than the powder. For women whose heads were shaved, either by the camp authorities to control typhus or by vengeful locals marking them as collaborators, the loss of hair was a phantom limb pain. They would reach up to brush hair that wasn't there, feeling only the stubble and the cold wind biting the scalp. It was a stripping of gender identity so complete that many women refused to look at their reflections in tin cans or puddles for months. The material shock, the bucket trick. In this landscape of deprivation, the entire material world contracted down to a single object, the container. It might be a rusted Wehrmacht helmet, a jagged tin can retrieved from a trash pit, or a dented American mess tit traded for a wedding ring. This vessel was the difference between life and death. The bucket trick wasn't a magic trick. It was a desperate improvisation of physics. A helmet was a chair to keep you off the wet ground. Turned over, it was a wash basin for a cat bath using a cup of cold water. Held over a small fire of twigs, it was a cooking pot for nettle soup. And at night, in the crowded, aired Hullen, where leaving meant losing your sleeping spot or stepping into the freezing mud, it was a chamber pot. The intimacy of this object is hard to overstate. You ate from the same vessel you washed in. The metallic taste of the spoon against the teeth, the scrape of the last calorie of watery soup, became a focused, meditative act. To lose your bucket was a catastrophe. There are accounts of women weeping not over lost homes or dead husbands, but over a stolen tin can. Why? Because the can was the only thing they owned. It was the only barrier between their bodies and the absolute chaos of the camp. It was the first tool of their new life, an anchor of civilization in a sea of mud. The fraternization paradox, the scent of lucky strikes. The third angle is the most complex: the proximity of the victor. For the first few months, there was the ban. General Eisenhower's non-fraternization policy was strict. Americans were forbidden to speak to Germans, shake hands, or share food. "Don't give in" posters hung in every mess hall. But biology ignores bureaucracy. For a German woman in 1946, the American soldier was a sensory overload. He didn't smell like the war. He smelled of aftershave, high-octane gasoline, and, most potently, tobacco. The scent of a Lucky Strike or Camel cigarette drifting across a barbed wire fence was intoxicating to a population that had been smoking dried leaves and moss. The somatic reality of fraternization was often transactional, born of desperate material need. The currency of the occupation was the cigarette. A single cigarette could buy a loaf of bread. A pack could buy a woman's dignity. The Schokoladenmädchen became a derogatory term, but it masked a gritty survival strategy. It wasn't about romance. It was about the physical warmth of sitting inside a heated Jeep instead of a freezing cellar. It was about the texture of nylons. To understand the shock of nylon stockings, you have to remember the sensation of war legs, skin chafed by coarse wool, stained with soot and unshaven for years. When an American soldier offered a pair of sheer nylons, it wasn't just clothing, it was a restoration of the feminine self. Sliding them on was a tactile reminder of a world that wasn't gray, rough and abrasive. But the cost was high. The transaction often took place in the shadows of ruins, a hurried, silent exchange of body for goods, leaving a lingering aftertaste of shame that no amount of chocolate could wash away. The sugar shock. Then there was the food itself. To a palate adapted to the sour, earthy taste of turnips and black bread, American rations were alien. The Hershey bar was a weapon of psychological warfare. When a prisoner or a starving woman first tasted American milk chocolate, the reaction was often physiological panic. The sugar content was so high compared to the German wartime diet that it caused dizzy spells, a rapid heart rate, and an immediate dopamine spike. It was happy food in a sad world. Mothers would dissolve a single square of chocolate in a pot of hot water to create a weak cocoa for their children, stretching the miracle as far as physics would allow. The taste of that cocoa, sweet, creamy, foreign, broke the stoicism that had kept them alive. It was the taste of the end of the war, and it was overwhelming. The white bread shock, eating the enemy's surplus. It didn't come with a treaty signing or a loud speech. It came quietly, wrapped in wax paper. It is late 1946. In a processing center near Ulm, a line of women shuffle forward. They are silent, their eyes fixed on the muddy boots of the woman in front of them. The air smells of wet concrete and the faint, sweet scent of American exhaust fumes. At the head of the line, a field kitchen has been set up. The GI manning it looks bored. To him, this is just Tuesday. To the women, this is the altar of judgment. When the woman reaches the front, she extends her bucket, a dented tin can with a wire handle. The ladle splashes a yellow, fatty broth into it. But then, the soldier does something else. He reaches into a crate and tosses a thick slice of white bread on the side of her tray. She stares at it. It is blindingly white. In the German culinary lexicon of 1946, bread is dark, heavy, and sour, a brick of rye and sawdust that requires jaw strength to chew. This American object looks like a sponge. It has no hard crust. It feels impossibly light in her hand, almost weightless, like it's made of air. She moves to a corner of the yard, huddling against a wall to protect her prize from wind and thieves. She touches the surface. It is soft, yielding to her dirty fingerprint. Is it cake? Is it a trick? She tears off a corner. The texture is alien, smooth, uniform, lacking any grain or grit. She puts it in her mouth. The sensation is immediate and disorienting. It dissolves. There is no chewing required. The taste is overwhelmingly sweet to a palate accustomed to bitterness. It tastes of refined sugar, chemical yeast, and pure, unadulterated wheat. It is the taste of a country that hasn't known a day of hunger. In that moment, the propaganda of the final victory evaporates completely. You cannot fight a nation that bakes bread like cake for its prisoners. The physical shock of the high glycemic carbohydrates hitting her bloodstream makes her dizzy. Her mouth floods with saliva, a painful glandular reaction she hasn't felt in months. She doesn't just eat it, she inhales it. And then the somatic reaction shifts from pleasure to pain. Her stomach, shrunken and rigid, cramps violently against the sudden influx of rich, processed food. She gags, clamping a hand over her mouth, terrified she will lose the calories she just gained. The white bread shock is the visceral realization of total defeat. It is the moment the body admits what the mind refused to. We are at their mercy. The human friction, a transaction without cost. The shock of the bread was metabolic. The shock of the interaction was psychological. It happens in the gray light of a loading dock in Mannheim. A young woman, her face smeared with soot to make herself look older, a common defense mechanism against assault, clutches the hand of her 4-year-old niece. The child has stopped crying days ago. She has entered the silent, lethal phase of starvation, where the body saves energy by shutting down emotion. An American Jeep idles nearby. The engine heat radiates in waves, a tantalizing island of warmth in the freezing air. A GI steps out. He is huge, fed on the 4,000-calorie-a-day combat diet, his uniform bursting with the health of a nation untouched by famine. He chews gum, a rhythmic cow-like motion that fascinates the starving prisoners. He walks toward them. The woman stiffens. Her somatic memory of men in uniform over the last 12 months has been one of shouting, taking, and hurting. She pulls the child behind the folds of her skirt, bracing for the demand, "Papier? Come?" But the soldier stops. He looks at the woman, then down at the silent child. He reaches into his webbing. The woman's heart hammers against her ribs. Is it a weapon? A citation? He pulls out a small olive drab tin. C ration. Unit M1, meat and beans. He doesn't hand it to the woman. He crouches down, a violation of the physical hierarchy between victor and vanquished, and holds it out to the child. He pries the lid open with a P38 can opener on his dog tags. The smell of tomato sauce and salted pork hits the air, overpowering the stench of wet wool. "Here, kid," he mutters. The language is alien, but the tone is low and soft. He presses the tin into the child's hands and walks away. No demand for sex, no demand for labor, no lecture on guilt, just a calorie transfer. The woman stares at his back. This unearned kindness breaks her. If he had hit her, she would have stood firm, but this casual charity undoes the knots of her survival instinct. She slides down the brick wall, her legs giving way, and begins to weep. Ugly, heaving sobs that racked her entire skeletal frame. She cries not for the food, but because the interaction forced her to remember that she is human, and for the first time in years, she is safe enough to fall apart. The somatic legacy. Scars that don't fade. The camp's emptied, the wire was rolled up, but the body remembers. For the women who walked out of the Rheinwiesenlager or the holding centers in 1947 and 1948, the war did not end. It merely moved deeper inside the tissue. The first legacy was the stomach. The white bread shock and the sudden introduction of fats often triggered refeeding syndrome on mass scale. Digestive systems that had atrophied could not handle the rich peacetime diet of 1,500 calories. Women suffered from chronic diarrhea and cramping for years. The lining of the gut had been stripped away by the rough roughage of the Hunger Years, the acorn coffee, the sawdust bread, the nettles. Many former prisoners carried a nervous stomach for the rest of their lives, a physiological PTSD that flared up at the smell of burnt toast or the sight of a wasted meal. Then there was the cold. The frostbite sustained during the winter of 1946 left permanent neurological damage. It wasn't just a scar, it was a winter itch. Every time the temperature dropped in later years, the toes and fingers of these women would turn red, swell, and burn, a condition known as pernio, chronic chilblains. It served as a seasonal reminder, a somatic alarm clock that rang every November, bringing the sensation of the mud hole back into a warm living room. Perhaps the deepest silence surrounded fertility. The amenorrhea, cessation of menstruation, lasted long after the calories returned. In the gynecological wards of post-war Germany, the waiting rooms were filled with young women terrified that the hunger winter had permanently sterilized them. They felt broken, hollowed out by history. When cycles finally returned, often years later, it was celebrated, not just as a medical recovery, but as a reclaiming of womanhood from the void of the camps. And visibly, there was the hair. As the shaved heads of the punished women began to grow back, they entered the bristle phase. They couldn't style it, they couldn't hide it. It grew in spikes, marking them publicly. A woman walking down the street with 2 inches of hair in 1947 was a walking text. Everyone knew where she had been or what had been done to her. They wore headscarves tight and low, developing a specific posture, chin down, eyes averted, that became the somatic signature of a generation trying to disappear in plain sight. The Pantry Trauma, a war that never left the kitchen. The release came on a slip of cheap recycled paper, the Entlassungsschein, discharge slip. It was often stamped with the letter D for disarmed, not P for prisoner, a final bureaucratic insult that denied them back pay or veteran benefits. But the paper meant they could walk. They walked back into cities that were lunar landscapes of rubble, but as the economic miracle, Wirtschaftswunder, of the 1950s began to pave over the ruins, the Wehrmacht-Helferinnen carried the camp into their kitchens. The somatic legacy manifested in a specific neurosis, the pantry trauma. Visit the cellar of a journal grandmother in 1985, 40 years after the surrender. You will find shelves groaning under the weight of jarred preserves, Einwecken. You will find sacks of sugar, flour, and coffee stacked to the ceiling, enough to last a family for 6 months. This was not stocking up. This was a pathological response to the starvation of 1946. The body, having once eaten itself, refused to ever feel that specific emptiness again. These women could not throw away food. To discard a moldy crust of bread caused physical anxiety, a tightening of the chest. They cooked heavy, fatty meals, dumplings swimming in butter, roasts dripping in gravy, force-feeding a generation of children who had never known hunger, trying to inoculate them against a starvation that existed only in the mother's memory. The scent of the victor. And what of the Americans? The golden cage left a complex sensory imprint. For decades, the smell of palmolive soap or the specific sweet aroma of Virginia tobacco could trigger a flashbulb memory for these women. It wasn't simple nostalgia, it was a confusing mix of shame and gratitude. That smell meant defeat. It meant the humiliation of the Entlassung, but it also meant the C-ration tin handed to a starving child. It meant survival. The Ami was the figure who had destroyed their world with bombs and then rebuilt their bodies with white bread. This duality created a silence. These stories were rarely told at dinner tables. The details, the lice, the bucket, the menstrual rags, were too gritty, too humiliating for the clean, rebuilt Germany. They remained locked in the body, spoken only in the ache of frostbitten toes on a winter morning, or the trembling hand reaching for a second slice of cake that they didn't need, but had to have. The intimate archive. History is usually written in ink, on treaties, maps, and casualty lists. It speaks of borders moved and regimes toppled. But there is another history written in the intimate archive of the human body. The story of the German women POWs and the hunger winter is not found in the grand strategy of the Allied occupation. It is found in the microscopic details of survival. It is a history written in the density of a bone that never quite recovered its calcium. It is written in the scar tissue of a chilblain that throbs when the pressure drops. It is preserved in the anxiety of a grandmother who cannot sleep unless the pantry is full. These somatic markers tell a story that maps cannot. The transition from total war to total dependency was not a political abstraction. It was a physical shock. The white bread shock was more than a culinary experience. It was the moment the ideology of the Third Reich finally dissolved, not by argument, but by digestion. You could lie about the front lines, but you couldn't lie about the taste of American wheat. The body knows the truth long before the mind accepts it. As we look back at 1945 to 1948, we must look past the grainy newsreels of generals shaking hands. We must look into the mud of the Rheinwiesenlager and the dim light of the cellar. There, we find the true texture of the post-war world, a mix of shame, hunger, and the confusing, overwhelming taste of a stranger's kindness. The war ended on paper in May 1945, but in the bodies of the women who survived it, the negotiations between hunger and dignity continued for a lifetime. When we study Alltagsgeschichte, we are really studying the resilience of the human organism. We are bearing witness to the fact that when civilizations collapse, what remains is the simple, brutal, and beautiful struggle to stay warm, to stay clean, and to eat.